The fixed sight. The first thing Colonel Heinrich Brenner noticed about the Russian prisoner wasn't his torn uniform or frostbitten hands, it was the rifle he'd been captured with. A Mosin-Nagant M38, ancient by Wehrmacht standards, with a sight that had been welded into position. The weapon lay across his desk in Stalag 17th B's administrative building, its scarred wooden stock telling a story he couldn't yet read. Fixed sight, the interrogation officer had noted dismissively in his report. Primitive weapon, no tactical value. But as Brenner examined the rifle in the dim Austrian mountain light filtering through frost-covered windows, something about the wear patterns made him pause. This wasn't the random damage of a conscript's weapon. The stock showed methodical use. The metal components bore the subtle polish of constant handling. Someone had transformed this crude instrument into something else entirely. The prisoner was designated 4471R. Ivan Volkov, according to documents found when German mountain troops captured him near the Carpathian Forest Pass, the locals called Vulci Brana, Wolf's Gate. 3 weeks had passed since then, and the man offered nothing during interrogation beyond name, rank, and a service number that Wehrmacht intelligence couldn't verify. Stories filtered through the camp's hierarchy painted a picture that didn't match the broken figure now assigned to lumber detail. For 7 days, an entire German mountain company, nearly 200 men, had been pinned down in that narrow forest pass. Every attempt to advance met impossibly accurate rifle fire from positions that shifted like smoke through the trees. Brenner remembered the mountain troops' faces when they'd first arrived at the camp. These were elite soldiers, men trained in alpine warfare. Yet they spoke in hushed tones about a ghost in the forest who could see through fog and shoot around corners. Officers had fallen at ranges that should have been impossible for standard infantry weapons. Radio operators were picked off moments after establishing contact. The harassment was so precise. Sergeant Klaus Weber had whispered during the informal debriefing, so unrelenting. Some of the men started refusing direct orders to advance. What troubled Brenner wasn't just the tactical implications. The unknown shooter had demonstrated an understanding of German doctrine that bordered on prescient, always striking when forward momentum was building, always targeting individuals whose loss would cause maximum disruption, as if someone had studied Wehrmacht mountain warfare manuals and designed a perfect counter-strategy. The breakthrough had come only when a Stuka dive bomber, diverted from another mission, spotted movement in the tree line and dropped its payload on what appeared to be empty forest. When the mountain troops finally advanced through smoldering timber, they'd found a network of carefully concealed shooting positions connected by paths so subtle they seemed like natural animal trails. At the center of this network, partially buried under bombing debris, they'd discovered Ivan Volkov, unconscious but alive, still clutching his fixed sight Mosin-Nagant. Now Brenner watched through his office window as Volkov worked the lumber detail with other prisoners. The Russian moved with careful economy, suggesting old injuries never properly healed, but his hands remained steady. His eyes never stopped cataloguing details, guard positions, daily routines, watchtower placements. The behavior of someone for whom situational awareness had become survival instinct. The rifle itself had been placed in the camp's trophy room, along with other captured weapons deemed interesting by visiting Wehrmacht officers. But Brenner found himself returning to examine it repeatedly, trying to understand how such a crude-looking instrument had achieved such sophisticated results. If stories like this make you question what you'd do in someone else's boots, tell us in the comments how you imagine you'd react in this camp. And stay with us for the next chapters. What kind of man transforms from university professor to precision marksman, using nothing but an obsolete rifle and pure determination? The Mosin-Nagant M38 was a carbine variant, shorter than standard sniper rifles, and typically considered unsuitable for precision work beyond 300 meters. Its fixed sight meant no adjustment for range or windage. theoretically limiting effectiveness to close-range combat. Yet evidence from Vulci Brana suggested shooting at distances far beyond the weapon's supposed capabilities. Brenner had quietly interviewed mountain troops, and their descriptions of engagement ranges didn't match the rifle's specifications. Either trained soldiers were mistaken about distances, unlikely, or Volkov had compensated for the weapon's limitations through skill that military manuals claimed impossible without adjustable optics. The mystery deepened when Brenner discovered Volkov's background. Not a professional soldier or hunter, but a mathematics professor at Moscow University before the war. An academic who had somehow transformed himself into a marksman capable of single-handedly stopping a German advance. Professor Volkov taught advanced calculus. The camp interpreter, an Austrian linguistics student named Franz Müller, reported after reviewing captured documents. Published papers on trajectory mathematics and ballistic physics. Brenner felt an unwelcome chill. The transformation suggested either exceptional natural talent or dedication to mastering the weapon that bordered on obsessive. A mathematics professor applying theoretical knowledge to deadly practical purpose. Winter was settling deep around Stalag 78 B. The camp sat in a valley between Austrian peaks, where morning mist clung to barbed wire and watchtowers disappeared into low clouds. Prisoners worked lumber details to supply heating for the camp, their breath forming white clouds in the thin mountain air. Volkov worked alongside other prisoners, splitting logs with methodical precision. Brenner observed from the administrative building's heated interior, watching the Russians' movements. Every action was economical, purposeful. When other prisoners paused to rest or warm their hands, Volkov maintained steady rhythm. "He's different from the others," commented Dr. Hans Richter, the camp's medical officer, joining Brenner at the window. "Doesn't complain about the cold, doesn't seek extra rations, just works. You've examined him." Briefly, old injuries, poorly healed, shrapnel scars on his back and shoulder. But his hands, Richter paused, steady as a surgeon's. No tremor, no hesitation. The camp routine continued its predictable cycle. Morning roll call, work details, evening meals, curfew. But Brenner found his attention repeatedly drawn to prisoner 4471R. The Russian adapted to camp life with unsettling efficiency, learning guard schedules, understanding unspoken rules, navigating the complex social dynamics among prisoners without drawing attention. Other Russian prisoners treated Volkov with subtle deference. Not fear exactly, but recognition of something that set him apart. During evening conversations in the barracks, voices lowered when he spoke. Even prisoners who'd been in the camp longer seemed to defer to his quiet authority. "What did you do before the war?" Brenner asked during Volkov's first formal interview, conducted through interpreter Müller. The response was immediate, delivered in careful Russian. "Mathematics professor, Moscow University." "What kind of mathematics?" A longer pause, then applied physics, trajectory calculations. The answer hung in the air like morning mist over the camp's watchtowers. Brenner felt the weight of unstated implications. A professor of trajectory mathematics, captured with a rifle that had terrorized an entire German mountain company through impossible precision shooting. Outside the interview room's small window, snow began falling on the Austrian valley. Each flake followed its own calculated path to Earth, governed by physics principles that Professor Ivan Volkov understood better than most. How does a man of science transform himself into an instrument of war while retaining his essential humanity? Letters arrived at Stalag 78 B with the irregularity of mountain weather, sometimes bunched together after weeks of silence, other times trickling in one by one. The Austrian postal system, strained by wartime demands, delivered mail to the camp whenever transportation permitted. For the German staff, letters brought news from home that grew increasingly grim. Cities under bombardment, food shortages, casualty lists that seemed to lengthen with each delivery. For prisoners, mail was a lifeline to a world that felt increasingly distant. Brenner noticed that Volkov never received letters. While other Russian prisoners gathered eagerly whenever mail call echoed across the compound, the mathematics professor continued his work, seemingly indifferent to news from the outside world. "No family?" Brenner asked Dr. Richter during one of their informal discussions about camp morale. "Possible, or perhaps his family doesn't know where he is." Richter paused, considering. Many Soviet records were lost during the retreats. Entire regiments disappeared from official documentation. The absence of personal connections made Volkov even more enigmatic. Other prisoners spoke of wives, children, parents worried sick about their fate. They shared photographs, read letters aloud, maintained emotional anchors to their former lives. Volkov existed in the present moment with monk-like detachment. Winter deepened in the Austrian valley. Snow accumulated against the camp's fence lines, and morning temperatures dropped below freezing. The lumber detail became more crucial as heating demands increased. Prisoners worked longer hours, cutting and splitting wood to keep the camp's buildings warm. During these extended work sessions, Brenner observed subtle interactions between Volkov and other prisoners. The Russian offered quiet advice about efficient wood-splitting techniques, demonstrated proper axe handling to prevent injury, and shared his rations with prisoners who seemed weakest. These small acts of kindness contradicted everything Brenner had been taught about Soviet soldiers. Propaganda described them as fanatical, brutal, indoctrinated to hate everything German. Yet here was a man who had single-handedly terrorized an entire company, now showing gentle consideration for fellow prisoners' welfare. "Something troubles you, Colonel?" Dr. Richter joined Brenner at the administrative building's window, watching Volkov help an elderly Polish prisoner repair his worn boots. "The contradictions," Brenner admitted. "This man killed our soldiers with mathematical precision, yet look at him now." Below in the yard, Volkov was demonstrating a technique for waterproofing leather using pine resin. His movements were patient, instructive. The Polish prisoner listened intently, nodding as he learned skills that would help him survive winter. "Perhaps the contradiction is in our assumptions," Richter suggested quietly. "We've been told what to expect from Soviet prisoners. But what if our information is incomplete?" The question hung between them, like smoke from the camp's chimneys. Brenner found himself remembering his own service in the previous war, when enemies had occasionally shown unexpected humanity. But this felt different, more personal. News from the Eastern Front continued to darken. Reports spoke of fierce Soviet resistance, winter warfare that favored defenders, and German advances slowing in the face of determined opposition. The war that had seemed close to victory months earlier was revealing itself as something far more complex and costly. That evening, Brenner returned to the trophy room to examine Volkov's rifle once more. The Mosin-Nagant sat among other captured weapons: machine guns, mortars, anti-tank rifles, sophisticated equipment that represented the industrial might of nations at war. Yet this simple rifle, with its welded sight, had proven more effective than any of them. Not because of technological superiority, but because of the human intelligence that had wielded it. Mathematics applied to destruction, yes, but also mathematics applied to survival. Do you think you'd cling to what you were taught back home, or to what your own eyes see in a place like this? Comment which side you'd lean toward, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. When does a weapon become more dangerous? In the hands of a fanatic, or in the hands of someone who truly understands it? The camp's daily routine had settled into winter rhythms by the time Franz Müller, the Austrian interpreter, made his disturbing discovery. While organizing captured documents in the administrative building's basement archive, he found materials that hadn't been properly catalogued during Volkov's initial processing. "Colonel Brenner," Müller called up the stairs, his voice carrying unusual tension. "You need to see this." The documents were handwritten notes in Russian, tucked inside what appeared to be a standard mathematics textbook. Müller's translation was halting but clear. Detailed observations of German mountain warfare tactics, sketches of typical advance formations, timing calculations for radio communications, and vulnerability assessments for officer positioning. "He was studying us," Muller whispered, "like we were a mathematical problem to be solved." The papers revealed the methodical mind that had transformed a university professor into such an effective combatant. Volkov hadn't simply learned to shoot accurately. He had analyzed German tactical doctrine with academic thoroughness and developed counter-strategies based on scientific observation. Brenner felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Austrian winter. The enemy had taken an intellectual, handed him an obsolete rifle, and produced a combatant capable of neutralizing elite mountain troops through pure analytical thinking. "What kind of training program creates soldiers like this?" he asked Dr. Richter later that day. "Perhaps no training at all," Richter replied thoughtfully. "Perhaps just desperation and intelligence applied to survival." Outside, the lumber detail continued its work. Volkov moved among the other prisoners with quiet efficiency, but Brenner now watched him with different understanding. Every gesture seemed calculated, every movement purposeful. The Russian was still analyzing, still learning. That afternoon brought news that changed the camp's atmosphere entirely. A Red Cross inspection was scheduled for the following week. Representatives would tour facilities, interview prisoners, and file reports on conditions at Stalag 17B. Preparations began immediately. Barracks were cleaned, work schedules adjusted, medical facilities prepared for scrutiny. Camp Commandant Werner Fischer called a staff meeting to review protocols for international inspection. "Everything must be proper," Fischer emphasized. "No irregularities, no complaints from prisoners. The Reich's reputation depends on our compliance with international conventions." Brenner wondered what the Red Cross inspectors would make of prisoners like Volkov. Would they see a quiet academic adapting to unfortunate circumstances, or something more complex? Would they understand the contradictions that made simple moral judgments impossible? The evening before the inspection, Brenner made an unscheduled visit to the prisoners' barracks. Official justification was routine security check, but his real purpose was observing how Volkov interacted with fellow prisoners when German supervision was minimal. What he found challenged his expectations once again. The Russian was teaching basic mathematics to younger prisoners, using charcoal on wooden boards to demonstrate calculations. The lesson appeared to focus on practical applications, resource allocation, work efficiency, survival strategies disguised as academic instruction. "Professor," one young Polish prisoner asked in broken Russian, "how do you calculate distance when you cannot measure directly?" Volkov's response was patient, methodical. He explained triangulation, reference point mathematics, and estimation techniques. Skills that could apply to carpentry or agriculture, or to precision shooting across uncertain terrain. Brenner realized he was witnessing something unprecedented. Enemy instruction, continuing in captivity, knowledge transferred between prisoners that could make them more effective if they ever returned to combat. Yet the teaching was also fundamentally humanitarian, giving desperate men tools for intellectual engagement that helped them maintain dignity. The contradiction crystallized everything troubling about prisoner 4471R. Here was a man who had killed German soldiers with mathematical precision, now using the same analytical skills to help fellow prisoners survive. Enemy and educator, destroyer and protector, all contained within the same quiet figure, splitting logs in an Austrian valley. "Doctor." Richter found Brenner standing alone in the administrative building later that evening, staring out at the snow-covered compound. "The inspection worries you?" "The questions it will raise," Brenner replied. "What do we tell them about men like Volkov? That he's a dangerous enemy, that he's a model prisoner, both, neither." Outside, snow continued falling on the camp's watchtowers and fence lines, each flake following the trajectory physics that Professor Ivan Volkov understood so well. How many contradictions can exist in one man before something essential breaks? The Red Cross inspection proceeded with Swiss punctuality. Two representatives, Dr. Elisabeth Weber, a physician from Geneva, and Jakob Steiner, an administrative observer, toured Stalag 7 B with methodical thoroughness. They examined facilities, reviewed records, and conducted private interviews with selected prisoners. Brenner watched nervously as they approached Volkov during the lumber detail inspection. The mathematics professor answered questions in careful German, his responses revealing impressive linguistic ability that hadn't appeared in previous interrogations. "You are treated well?" Dr. Weber asked. "Yes, according to international conventions. Adequate food, medical care, living conditions, adequate for the circumstances. Any complaints about your treatment?" A pause that lasted several heartbeats. "No complaints." Later, reviewing the inspection records, Brenner discovered something that stopped him cold. Dr. Weber had made a notation about prisoner 4471R that revealed knowledge she shouldn't have possessed. Subject shows signs of chronic malnutrition predating capture by several months. Suggests significant hardship in Soviet forces before military action at Wolf's Gate. How had she known about Wolf's Gate? That operation remained classified, known only to the mountain troops directly involved and senior camp staff. The Red Cross shouldn't have access to tactical intelligence about specific capture locations. Franz Müller, reviewing the same documents, offered a disturbing explanation. "The Red Cross has sources throughout the theater. They may know more about individual prisoners than we do." That evening, Brenner made a decision that violated protocol. He arranged a private conversation with Dr. Weber before her departure, using his authority as camp intelligence officer to request informal discussion about prisoner welfare. "Professor Volkov interests you," she observed, settling into a chair in the administrative building's small conference room. "His background is unusual. Mathematics professor turned sniper. Yes, we've encountered similar cases throughout the war." Her tone was matter-of-fact, professional. "Intellectuals adapting to combat necessity. You know about his military record?" Dr. Weber's smile was thin. "Colonel Brenner, the Red Cross monitors many things. We know about the engagement at Vulci Brana. We know about the casualties your mountain company sustained. And we know that Professor Volkov was defending a village that had been evacuated 3 days earlier." The revelation hit like cold mountain air. Evacuated. Civilian population relocated before your advance. Professor Volkov remained behind, alone, to delay German forces and ensure safe withdrawal. He held an entire company at bay for 7 days, using nothing but an obsolete rifle and superior understanding of mathematics. Brenner felt the foundation of his assumptions cracking. He was protecting refugees. Elderly villagers, families with children, people who couldn't move quickly through mountain terrain. Professor Volkov calculated exactly how long they needed to reach safety, then provided that time through precision harassment of your advance. The mathematics professor's actions suddenly appeared in an entirely different context. Not fanatical resistance, not ideological warfare, but calculated self-sacrifice to protect innocent civilians. A man who had used his analytical skills, not for conquest, but for mercy. Why tell me this? Because you've been watching him. Because you're trying to understand what kind of enemy you're dealing with. And because the answer matters for how prisoners are treated in the future. That night, Brenner returned to the trophy room where Volkov's Mosin-Nagant sat among captured weapons. The rifle looked different now, not an instrument of fanatical aggression, but a tool used for precisely calculated heroism. He thought about the village children who had reached safety, while Professor Ivan Volkov held mathematical equations in his mind and German forces at bay. 7 days of impossible shooting, every shot designed not to maximize casualties, but to maximize time. The fixed sight that Wehrmacht officers had dismissed as primitive limitation had been the foundation of expertise built on principle that mastery of simple tools could achieve results sophisticated equipment could not. Not because the rifle was advanced, but because the man using it understood exactly what needed to be accomplished. Outside, snow fell steadily on Stalag 38B. Somewhere in the prisoners' barracks, Professor Volkov was probably teaching mathematics to fellow prisoners, sharing knowledge that helped them maintain dignity and hope. Tomorrow, the Red Cross representatives would file their report. International monitors would note compliance with conventions, adequate treatment of prisoners, proper facilities for men caught in circumstances beyond their control. But they wouldn't record the deeper truth. That war had taken a man who taught calculus to university students and transformed him into someone capable of holding an entire military unit at bay through pure intellectual determination. And that same transformation had somehow left his essential humanity intact. When principles and survival instincts align, what kind of person emerges from that crucible? Spring came late to the Austrian valley, but when it arrived, it transformed Stalag 38B's landscape overnight. Snow melted from the compound's fence lines, revealing ground that had been frozen for months. The lumber detail's work shifted from heating fuel to construction materials as the camp prepared for seasonal maintenance. Volkov continued his quiet routine, but Brenner noticed subtle changes. The Russian engaged more freely with other prisoners, teaching not just mathematics, but practical skills, woodworking, leather repair, techniques for maintaining tools, knowledge transfer that seemed motivated by genuine concern for fellow prisoners' welfare. In May, news arrived that changed everything. Soviet forces had broken through German lines near Vienna. The war's momentum was shifting, and prisoner exchanges were being negotiated through neutral intermediaries. Stalag 38B would be liberated within weeks. The announcement created complex emotions throughout the camp. Prisoners felt hope mixed with uncertainty about homecoming after months or years in captivity. Guards faced their own uncertain futures in a war that was clearly ending. Brenner found himself troubled by questions that had no clear answers. What would happen to men like Volkov when they returned home? Would the Soviet authorities understand what had driven a mathematics professor to become such an effective combatant? Would they value the analytical mind that had held an entire German company at bay, or view his survival in captivity with suspicion? The final weeks passed quickly. Administrative preparations for prisoner transfer, medical examinations, documentation updates. Brenner processed dozens of cases, but his attention repeatedly returned to prisoner 4471R. On the last day before transfer, he made another decision that violated strict protocol. Using his authority as intelligence officer, he arranged final private interview with Volkov, ostensibly to complete administrative records. "Professor," he began, speaking in German he now knew the Russian understood perfectly. "You could have told us earlier. About the village. About the civilians you were protecting." Volkov's response was measured, thoughtful. Would it have changed anything? The question hung between them. Brenner realized that knowledge of the professor's heroic motivation wouldn't have altered camp routine or prisoner treatment. It might have brought unwanted attention, additional interrogations, complications that would have made survival more difficult. "Perhaps not," Brenner admitted. "But it would have changed how I understood you." "Understanding changes nothing unless it leads to action." Another pause. Then Volkov added, "You are not what I expected from a Wehrmacht officer." "What did you expect?" "Certainty, unquestioning conviction. Men who never doubt what they have been taught." A slight smile. "But you have been questioning, Colonel Brenner. I have watched you watching me." The observation was accurate and unsettling. Brenner had been questioning everything, about enemies, about loyalty, about the nature of heroism itself. The mathematics professor had forced him to confront contradictions that made simple judgments impossible. What will you do when you return home? Teach mathematics, Volkov replied immediately, if they will let me. Young minds need to understand that problems can be solved through careful analysis, that limitations can be transformed into advantages through intelligence and patience. 3 days later, Soviet representatives arrived to collect their released prisoners. Brenner watched from his office window as Volkov boarded a transport truck with other Russians, carrying nothing but a small bundle of personal items and the knowledge that had kept him alive. The Mosin-Nagant remained in the trophy room, along with other captured weapons that would eventually be catalogued and stored in military museums. But its real victory lay not in the casualties it had inflicted, but in the questions it raised about assumptions, technology, and human adaptation under pressure. Years after the war ended, Brenner would still remember the quiet Russian professor who split logs with methodical precision. He would think about the fixed sight that had seemed like a limitation, but had been the foundation of deadly expertise. Most of all, he would remember that sometimes the most dangerous enemies were those who understood that limitations could be transformed into advantages through intelligence, patience, and absolute refusal to accept defeat. The war continued for 3 more years in Brenner's memory, but Professor Ivan Volkov had already taught him the lesson embedded in that scarred rifle, that mastery of simple tools, guided by principle and analytical thinking, could achieve results that sophisticated equipment could not. If this story reminded you that even in the darkest times, small acts of humanity still matter, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story. Sometimes the most dangerous weapon isn't the one that kills the most efficiently, but the one that forces you to question everything you thought you knew about your enemy.